Good morning, councillors. A very select group. Call to order the ordinary meeting of the Planning and Regulatory Committee. Purpose to deliberate the submission, the state of the environment monitoring and research charges. We'll go as per the agenda that's been circulated. I have apologies from Mrs. Payne. Do I have any other apologies? No doubt people will turn up in due course. We'll just confirm the order of business. I'll move that apologies for Mrs. Payne be received. I'll move. Seconded, Councillor Delberg. Those in favour will say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Confirmation as per the order of business. There'll be no changes to the agenda as been circulated. Interests, just update any interest you may have, and if there's any conflicts of interest you have during this part of the meeting, could you just please advise at that particular point in time. And the meeting is being live streamed on YouTube, so you'll need to use your microphones. The officer, you're the officer, Mr. Frizzell, so we'll take your report has been read. Anything you wish to highlight, add or amend or change?
Marina Koto, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there are some changes that I'd like to mention and signal at this stage. Essentially, we have reviewed the recommendations and aspects around the wastewater treatment, including septic tanks, and also made a revision around the invoicing process. So I have a revised schedule to circulate, picking up on those, and perhaps I should address those as we work through the particular submissions as are covered in the report. Also, I'd just like to lead in with just a reminder of the requirement for these charges. Essentially, under section 35 of the RMA, where the council is required to undertake state of environment monitoring. In fact, we're actually increasing the frequency and requirement to do that and the level of detail. So that this enables us to gather valuable information for decision making around resource management, especially around things like the cumulative effects of activities, the trends over time, and also the increased frequency that I mentioned enables us to understand peak loads and certain conditions of the environment. And that information feeds into decisions that are made around resource consents. So it sort of reflects that in making decisions on consent applications, we need to really understand the state of the environment in which that decision is being made. The information is useful for consent holders when they come to preparing their applications. Also helps them meet the conditions of their consent. So we move on to the first submission, and this is where, in relation to septic tanks and that issue. Under the current conditions, there is a permitted level of discharge from tanks up to 2,000 litres a day, and under certain parameters. The submitter is seeking to exclude his particular situation which actually there is a requirement for consent, but that's over a because even though that his system meets that requirement for the size, it is less than the 15 hectare provisions in the that permitted basis.
I've got a question here.
Yes?
In terms of the current consents allow for up to 2,000 litres per day.
Yes.
But the minimum land area is 15 hectares.
That's right.
So he's proposing that a low-level discharge, which is basically 20 cubic metres, that's 20,000 litres.
There's a distinction being made there about the permitted level and the charge level. So the permitted level is up to 2,000 litres a day, and he's querying whether at that level charges should apply, or should not apply, is what he's seeking.
Gotcha.
And to be consistent with that application or that submission and the other submission in relation to other wastewater treatment systems, there's a disconnect in a difference in the recommendations that have been made. So for the septic tank provisions, we had initially recommended that the charges don't apply, but for the other systems, we are suggesting that they do apply. So in reviewing that, we thought we should clarify that we're dealing with wastewater systems generally, which includes septic tanks, and that the charges should apply in both situations. So that's reflecting the fact that the consent holder is benefiting from the general state of environment monitoring and assessing the consents, and also over the lifetime of those consents, which can be up to 25 years, through the state of environment monitoring, we're able to pick up on any trends or issues that need to be addressed. So even though, and this is another point that I'll make later on, even though there are charges for the monitoring of particular consent conditions, it's often through our state of environment monitoring that we're doing on an increasing basis that we may pick up on an issue in relation to a particular discharge. So to be fair and consistent across all consent holders, rather than pick and choose between individual ones, it's considered fair and reasonable that the charges apply across the board. And I'd also note at that schedule, you'll see there's an increasing scale of charges, so those relatively lower level discharges in this case have a smaller fee. So that sort of reflects for the it makes sense that for the larger level of consents that have a greater impact, then they should pay a bit more each year.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just I had some questions on this. Something that interests me. On your 5.10, page 7, we're talking about the older septic tanks and discharge treatments. And undertake and confirm these standards are met. If extensive permitted monitoring would be needed to undertake to confirm. I'm assuming we're talking about the older septic tanks. And my question is, does that happen now? And is that practical?
Through you, Mr. Chair, could I just clarify the question? Is that statement just relates to older?
I'm getting the idea of the newer ones, and I'm going to ask a question on that, but the older septic tanks, again, I had septic tanks down the coast for about 10 years, so I've got a pretty good idea how they function and when they don't function. And so the question really is, on the older ones, you've mentioned down the bottom there an extensive permitted monitoring where we need to undertake to confirm these standards are met. Does that happen right now, and is it practical?
There is a degree of permitted activity monitoring, we're not monitoring every single situation. It's more likely to be picked up on a case-by-case basis. We did survey over the last year, for water takes and abstraction, and also when we become aware of a particular issue through permitted activity basis, then we would address that.
Okay, I think
So it's not in every case, I guess is the...
Yeah, through Mr. Chair, yeah, I'm kind of getting it's an ad hoc setup, which I need to know. And the other thing there was the officers support excluding septic tanks. I'm assuming these are the newer modern versions. So I'm talking 5.12, and I'm assuming that you are supporting the idea that we have a charge, and I see the charge seems reasonable in this case, $60 per annum. We seem to haven't mentioned the dollars yet, but that would seem pretty reasonable to me, and it's for monitoring, so I'm assuming then we would charge $60 a year and we would monitor that that's actually functioning.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we are proposing a charge of $60 a year in that case. The actual conditions of the consent have a different process, if you like. That's through there's a monitoring fee on the consent to ensure that the conditions are being followed up on. The general state of environment monitoring charges that we're proposing in this would potentially pick up on any problems in that particular area that could be traced back to, if need be, back to that particular consent.
So, sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, I'm just trying to get at one, which I haven't got no problem we charge for the consent. I've got no problem that we charge a performance or a monitoring fee. What I need to know is that we're actually then using that money to monitor. That's what I need to know. And what I'm hearing at the moment is, presently we've got an ad hoc system. I haven't got a problem with that either. When we're going to charge for a performance or monitoring, are we monitoring, or do we just take a pool of money and when we have a problem, we spend that money finding what the problem is?
So,
I might get, this is,
Thanks.
so through you, Mr. Chair, there's two components to what Mr. Frizella is talking about. The first is that the charges, in terms of the monitoring charges, go to the state of the environment monitoring. So that looks at, for example, discharges that are coming off the land and into rivers. So we monitor all of the rivers on an ongoing basis. Well, not all of the rivers, there's some issues in there, but we're monitoring the rivers in terms of water quality, and where there is an issue that might be E. coli related, that could be human waste, we will then track it back up the pipe, and it could be coming from a septic tank. So at that point, we would then trace it back to the source and deal with that. We are not using the money, that's the monitoring charges that are proposed, to monitor individual septic tanks. So the issue is the effect on the environment, so we're monitoring the environment. If there's found to be an issue in terms of E. coli that's human related, we would then track that back to the source. Does that make sense?
Mr. Chair, so these people are paying a percentage of the dollars that we collect to do our overall environment monitoring. So they are just paying their part in the process.
Correct.
The $60 seems reasonable. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I don't particularly like the principle that's being applied here. The range from 60 to 400 to 600 basically is the same service being provided. Introducing those extra high charges for the yeah. So how can we justify that extra charge for the actual services that are being provided? Are those extra charges of $400 and $600, are they being surreptitiously designed to change behaviour? What's the principle behind it? The service is being provided. Someone mentioned the risk before. I can't see how that applies. You pay for your service you get. You get 2 inspections a year. Why should I pay $600 when someone else is only paying $60?
So through you, Mr. Chair, the issue is around equity for a resource use. So essentially, those that are discharging more, so for example in the air quality space, are using a public good, essentially. We have to monitor that, and the greater the impact or the potential impact actually may end up us having to do more in that space. So, for example, a discharge to air that is large as compared to something that is small has a greater effect and therefore should be meeting more of the cost of that overall monitoring than somebody who's discharging less.
I think, thanks Mr Chair. Just to help my understanding, Councillor Barker's point, I mean, on that, is it just that same policy decision that we make in terms of a uniform rate versus a rating based on land value? I mean, it's essentially the same principle, isn't it? It's just a policy direction you're making based on use or value or a principle of equity, and then you're applying as opposed to a uniform way across the city or across users. And is there a second layer as well? So that's my first part. And B, is there also a bit of a user pays type situation, isn't it? Isn't it trying to, am I right in thinking that it's basically trying to take that as a part of the cost in terms of applying what's traditionally called a user pays type model to this?
So through you, Mr Chair, in terms of the first question, yes, there could be a policy decision that the council makes to set a uniform charge across the whole. What you would then end up doing is there would be some unders and overs in that space, so some people are going to have to pay more on what's being proposed, some would pay slightly less. It links into the second part of the question, Councillor Ackland, in terms of who is creating the effect, and therefore, yes, it is a user pays system that's being proposed.
I've got something to say when it comes to the debate.
Thank you, through the chair. I had a question relating to Councillor Dalberg's question. So he was seeking some clarification around septic tanks and 5.13, the recommendation, which is to amend the schedule to exclude septic tanks for discharges to land or water less than 20 cubic metres a day. I just wanted to find out, so the submission has come from someone who has an existing septic tank. So I just wanted to get a little bit more background how that will affect current. Will some people end up who would be paying will no longer have to pay? Because I note that it says here providing allotment sizes are at least 15 hectares in area and certain setbacks to boundaries, water takes and water sources are achieved. I guess I just don't see $60 a year as being that much money, so I'm curious as to why you've taken this approach to exclude these septic tanks.
Perhaps through you, Mr Chair, Councillor Fulton might not have picked up on the changed recommendation for that. So we're now sort of recommending that there is no exclusion, and that in that situation the charges would apply. Okay,
so this piece of paper here, which I've been given, is no longer correct.
That is the new one.
That's the new one. Yeah, if I can just perhaps clarify, it picks up on the point listed below with the asterisk. It's really just clarifying what the permitted activity basis is for wastewater treatment systems. So, and the fact that permitted activities, because they don't require a resource consent, logically the charges wouldn't apply in that situation.
Sorry, so can you just clarify to me then, that's saying something slightly different to 5.13 now?
Yes, 5.13, the recommendation there has essentially changed.
Has essentially changed to this in red.
Yes.
Apologies, I hadn't picked up on that. So are you now being even more, can you explain it to me again? I'm sorry. So you're now being even more lenient, so that $60 charge is effectively not being carried for almost all septic tanks. I guess I just am trying to understand, if you're having to trace E. coli in the rivers back to the septic tank, who's paying for that?
Yes, through you again, Mr Chair, if I can just be as clear as possible. Any resource consent for a discharge from a wastewater system, whether it be a septic tank or some other system. If it requires a resource consent, the charges will apply.
Okay. All right. So there's a decision made as to whether someone who's installing a septic tank needs a resource consent. If they need a resource consent, they'll be charged an annual fee of $60. If they don't need a resource consent, they won't be charged.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And the criteria for the resource consent is around the size of the land, the setbacks to boundaries, the water takes and water sources.
Yes, that's correct.
And what would happen if someone changed the use of that septic tank, like if they started to use it, I don't know if 200 metres squares, 200 cubic metres a day no, 20 cubic metres a day is, I'm trying to sort of figure out if that's a large amount or a small amount. What if somebody installs a septic tank saying they're going to use less than that, but then they start to use more?
So through you, Mr Chair, I might be able to assist with that. So what's being proposed is that the notation on the schedule says that if the discharge of wastewater, so this is a septic tank field, the wastewater field, is less than 2,000, and the land area is 15 hectares, then that meets the permitted activity standards in the current Nelson Resource Management Plan, doesn't need consent, so the charge won't be applied. 2,000 is a lot less than the 20 cubic metres, because that's something like 20,000, isn't it? Thank you, I'm just checking with Joe. Maths isn't my strong point. 20,000. So anything between 2,000 and 20,000 will get charged. They'll trigger a resource consent, and they'll get charged the $60.
Okay, thank you. I can see 2,000 versus 20 now. So what if someone says they're using less than 2,000 and they start using more than 2,000? How are you going to pick up on that?
Sorry, Councillor Fulton, I forgot that bit of your question. So that would be a compliance issue.
Yep.
So through the compliance team, they would be going out there and checking that, and if they then needed a resource consent because they're discharging more and the system needed upgrading and all those sorts of things, that would be worked through as part of the compliance check.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. I'm sorry about the 20 and the 2,000. I hadn't seen the difference. It looks like... Yeah, I knew it was a big amount, but cubic metres of Volkswagen. That's a lot.
I just ask a question to staff about clarifying. So whether I'm putting stuff onto the ground or in the river or what in the air, and there's probably two types of people I'm concerned about. There's one that does it extremely well. So I pay for the engineer and I'm doing fabulous, and there's no discharge until something breaks maybe, or then I've got the other people who probably aren't that diligent, and I'm only going to use, I'll leave the word diligent, and we end up tracking it back to their place. So I'm kind of liking the idea we're sharing this monitoring to the river systems, etc. But so what happens to the person? Do we fine them or whatever? How do we encourage everyone to do the due diligence? Because I'm getting this idea of spreading, what I'm not seeing in here is how do we actually put the carrot to the people who do all the work, and we don't hear from them ever because they're fabulous, and the other people.
So through you, Mr Chair, I'm going to answer this in quite a long-winded way. So anybody that trips into a resource consent process, so they trip a rule in the plan, whether it's a discharge to air, a discharge to water, discharge to land, have a potential effect on that system. And so these charges are looking to capture the monitoring that is required to deal with each of those natural systems. If there is a non-compliance with the resource consent that's been granted, so the resource consent's been granted and something happens, so say the system breaks down or there's an issue with the discharge being discharged to more, then the compliance team would go out and they would actively investigate that, and they would look at the options around what is needed to bring it back within the parameters of the resource consent. So there's a raft of things in that compliance space that we look at. First of all, it's all around education, but we then start to ramp up the compliance activity if the problem continues. So we would then step into potential enforcement if over a period of time it's not actually fixed.
Appreciate that, it's a great answer.
So we've got two submitters talked about permitted activities and water takes, and yet there's a charge being proposed.
Are we looking now at any chapter?
Yeah, we'll deal with 514 through to 516.
Yes, again, the only comment I would make on that, Mr. Chair, is just clarifying again that the charges don't apply to permitted activities because the trigger is resource consent application. So, yeah, just comments there are really to sort of clarify to the submitter because I think they were a bit confused and thought that we were charging or the charges would apply for permitted activities, which they're not.
Okay. Any questions of Ms. Frisell, the officers? Seems fairly clear. Which then takes you on to the existing monitoring charges, which is raise the issue sort of almost a double dipping.
Yes, again, through you, Mr. Chair, we've dealt with that perhaps a little bit in our preliminary discussions earlier. It's just acknowledging that we do have, there is a charge on consents for monitoring the conditions. What we're proposing here is an additional charge to cover the state of environment monitoring. And really is just sort of clarifying and justifying the need for those charges.
There's no change to your recommendation?
No.
So through Mr. Chair, if I can just add to that. So the charges that get on for monitoring for the that are monitoring of the consent conditions cover a raft of consent conditions. So if, for example, it's an application to take water, there are a number of conditions in there, including making sure that the system of the take is operating efficiently and various other conditions. So those general charges cover all of the consent conditions that sit on the consent. These charges are proposing to deal with the environmental.
Thank you. Any questions of this particular aspect? Okay. The short-term water takes for dewatering. I think you had two submissions there. Well, one submission from representing two oil companies.
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is really covering the situation, and I think it's just particular to oil companies when they apply ahead of time, well ahead of time, for quite a long period of time for their consent, whereas the activity that they're proposing for dewatering may only occur once in that entire period. But I guess they're being proactive in applying early. And the issue that they raise is that under the proposed charges, they would be subject to an annual fee when actually the activity that they're undertaking may only occur once within that period. So there's comments about that from the consents team, which explain that that's quite a good practice to be proactive in applying early, but the charges really should relate to when the activity is given effect to, which, as I say, may only be for a period of a year or so, and that rather than when the consent is issued. And I think that's reasonable, and I've made a recommendation to apply the charges in that situation just to when the activity takes place.
So how would that be, a question for me is, how would that be triggered? How would we trigger it?
Well, under the consent, the consent holder has to advise us when the actual activity is taking place, so we would know, and also the volume involved. It's also worth noting in point, I think it's 5.28, the fact that we permit dewatering up to a site, on a site up to 8 metres. And often, it may be well less than that, 4 to 4.5. So again, a consent may not be required. We get very few consents. So I think the submission that's been provided, it seems to be in the general nature to other councils, I think, on this very issue.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on this one? Councillor Barker?
Yeah, a question on the Ian and Barbara Stewart.
Well, we'll deal with that one in a moment. We're just dealing with the dewatering.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll come to that one shortly. Councillor Delberg?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. My question probably is the effect on the council. If we've got these, love the idea people are taking things in advance, but it's almost like we put it out there and collect all, anytime we want to do it, we can do it. What's the impact on the council staff? Do you actually have to check these things are being used every year? Or do you only worry about it when they tell you they're having an event?
So through you, Mr. Chair, it's probably best that I answer that one. So again, that sits in the compliance area rather than the science and environment team. If there is a consent and they only do it at certain periods of time, they have to notify us because there'll be a consent condition that says that. But we do ongoing monitoring as well in terms of compliance monitoring. So where we know we've got a consent that is running, the compliance team will, at random times, go and investigate those things if they think that there's an issue.
Very Mr. Chair, that's what I suspected was happening, and my concern at the moment is that staff time. So I say I'm going to do something over 10 years and do something on year 3 and year 7. You've got to actually check what I'm doing, and I tend to think there should be a charge, a partial charge for that maybe, and another charge for when they actually execute the time.
So through you, Mr. Chair, so that, remember we had that discussion before about the charges that sit in terms of the monitoring charges on the consent. Those are the ones that cover the time that might be required to go out and check those conditions.
I think you've explained it now, yet, so there's 2-stage here, like what we're doing. Thanks.
Correct. Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. That's a sort of very general submission opposing the introduction of the new charges and seeking the rationale for them. So what I've done there is just repeated points made earlier when the committee were considering the charges and outlining what they cover. The submitter was sort of implying it was perhaps an unfair burden on rural ratepayers or rural consent holders, which is not correct, because the charges apply throughout the region for those particular activities. So that's just what I recommend, just outlining what the rationale for them is, and there's no change to the recommendation there.
In relation to this one, how is it determined? In your comments, you said charges will only apply to consents benefiting from environmental monitoring and science programs. How do you decide who benefits? The submitters are making it very clear that there's a number of small, very small users in their area and are concerned that they're being charged for virtually nothing. And you're saying they won't be charged. So I want to know how you determine who and who doesn't get charged.
Through you, Mr Chair, the charges are only proposed for those that require resource consent. So it's only those parties that would be charged.
So existing situations have not had resource consents, they won't apply.
No, just to clarify, through you, Mr Chair, it's only consent holders that will be paying, and as mentioned before, the benefit to them is that in assessing their consent and also being able to pick up on any issues down the track with regard to that consent, that's where the charges are applied for permitted activities, or if there's no resource consent being applied for in that particular area, then the charges won't be applied.
And Mr Frizzell, can you clarify whether they're retrospective or not in terms of the charges?
No, the charges actually accrue from the 1st of January, so any consent holder from then, we're not charging for current, if you like, or past consents.
So they will only be applied to applications that come in from the 1st of January. So if, for example, the stewards needed to come in for a new consent, or their consent has expired for a particular activity, at that point in time, then it would incur the charges.
I think I understand.
Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Richard, can you just run through this for me very quickly again? So in the case of Barbara and Ian Stewart's submission, we're looking at water takes, of which they're reasonably common, as they say, because there's no reticulated supply. So are those small water takes, are they able to do that as a permitted activity, or do they all require consent? I just can't recall the rule.
So through Mr Chair, the stewards' take for the camp requires a resource consent because it's a larger take. I think they may have some individual supply to their house that doesn't require consent from memory. I can't quite remember.
All right, so through you, Mr Chair, clear. So what we're not talking specifically about the stewards' property, because what we've got in the submission is, in Nelson North, people have a number of streams with small water takes. NCC does not supply any of the infrastructure. They have families who will find it difficult to have more fees. So what I'm trying to establish is whether they will or won't have more fees. So if we have a planning rule that allows those small water takes to be a permitted activity, then what I'm understanding is they won't have any fees. But what I'm not sure is whether you can take any water as a permitted activity in our plan. Yeah.
Through you, Mr Chair, yes you can currently, and I have forgotten the amount. But the current plan does allow for a permitted activity take, and the proposed Nelson plan will do similar. There'll be a permitted volume that's allowed.
All right, so as we move forward, so they won't have need a consent, therefore they won't have conditions that need to be monitored, and therefore they won't be subject to the broader environmental state of the environment charging.
That's correct.
Either. Okay, all right, so so if we then go and look at who has, and this is an interesting exercise because this is a bit about when we're doing state of the environment monitoring, looking at environmental monitoring, sometimes it's that cumulative effect actually that is the issue. It's like it's a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and then that's kind of what we end up looking at. And the beneficiary of that monitoring, because it allows us to ensure that the water sources is suitable for drinking and all sorts of other things, the beneficiary are all of the parties that take from it. So I'm just in an equity point of view trying to work out if you've only got a few, and I don't have a sense of that across Nelson, who actually consented, then there will be a small number potentially who are going to be charged for the state of the environment monitoring, but potentially a much greater pool of beneficiaries. So I'm just thinking about that equity issue. How did the officers approach that?
So through you, Mr Chair, so there's an issue in terms of actually how we would manage charging permitted activities. So that's one aspect. So from a ability point of view to actually impose the charge, there's no trigger to be able to do it. So that's a technical issue. So that's one aspect of answering the question. The other aspect is that we had the conversation before, where you're doing more than the permitted amount, you're generating a greater effect. And so therefore, there is a natural resource use that you're using, and therefore there should be a nexus or connection between a charge and the fact that you're creating a greater effect.
Just ponder on that. Somehow, I kind of think the whole community benefits if we, from the state of the environment monitoring. So I'm thinking that what we're talking about here is in terms of the proportion of the total cost of the activity, we're actually talking about quite a small percentage when we're doing it directly, and so that's the equity argument.
Can I just be clear on the process we've got to date? So we've adopted the statement of proposal, and is it a situation of all options open for us? That, I mean, I saw the options within the statement of proposal. Is there any advice on the scope of our decision today in terms of the options available to us based on the submissions, or is it just anything we feel like doing we can do?
So through you, Mr. Chair, there is a limit in terms of what you're able to do. So it went out. There were submissions, so it would be to those points that have been raised in terms of, or the other option is you no longer proceed with it, would be that.
Yes, I've outlined the options there of adopting the amended draft changes, bearing in mind that I've already provided an update or revised some of the recommendations that are in the report, or essentially rejecting the draft charges, which the implications of that would be that the existing situation where the general ratepayer covers the entire cost of the environmental monitoring charges continues.
Well, as I expressed earlier by way of question, I have some misgivings, some concerns about particularly the 6,400 and 600 charges for discharges to land. What concerns me is that basically what we've got here is a two-component charge. There's one component which is the actual charge for the user pays. The other is a tax. It's a tax to cover the cost of environmental monitoring. And I don't think it's fair. I think, why penalise the good guy who's doing a good job? Why charge him 600? He's doing a good job, he's looking after it, and he's making sure that nothing gets into the environment, and we penalise him. Isn't it better? I mean, Economics 101 will tell you, you don't do that if you want to change behaviour. You hit the guy that is breaking the rules. So we're going to penalise the guy that's good, and someone else is going to break the rules, and all the charges for the environmental monitoring are going to be met unfairly by this guy. It's a greater good for the whole community, the environmental monitoring. What's the greater good to him? So I just don't think it's fair. We've got a tax and a charge, and we've mixed them all up as one and called them a charge, and it's not what I would call a good way to manage it.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Yeah. I'm sort of getting my head around this, that we actually have a charge for consents and then a charge for monitoring that consents are actually functioning. And then now this one here is actually an annual environmental monitoring and science charge, which I kind of get the idea we're stacking stuff on, but the question here is really to me is, do we actually want the environment monitored? How do you actually know that all the regulations, etc., the things that the council are held accountable for are going to be done, and there is a cost. So the question really is, do you actually put it across everybody out of the big bucket of rates, or do you charge for people who are doing activities? And I can kind of see both arguments, but I'm also conscious of the work the council staff have put into this, and it does make sense to me. So thank you for your time spent.
Oh yes, look, I'm going to speak in support of this. I think that the staff have done a really great job of making it as fair and equitable as they can, and I appreciate that for some users those charges are fairly significant, but it's important to understand that they are using, it is the activity which they're doing which requires the environmental monitoring. I think 4.2 sums it up very well, that the council has not previously charged a contribution towards the cost of environmental monitoring and science which supports resource consents. Instead, these costs have been borne by all ratepayers. It is considered to be more equitable and fair that the ongoing environmental monitoring required to ensure that consent holders' activities are undertaken without causing significant effects on the environment should be funded by the consent holders and general ratepayers when the need for this monitoring is driven in part by the consent holders' activity. So I think, I just wanted to comment, I mean normally I wouldn't need to debate, but I think because the concern's been raised by Councillor Barker, I do believe that this is an equitable approach, and I think that the staff have done their best to ensure that the small users are being charged a relatively small cost and the higher users are being charged a higher cost. Now that I've got my head around the 20 cubic metres versus 2,000 litres per day, I'm very comfortable with that change. I think that that's a fair change, that if you don't require a resource consent for a septic tank, then you're not being, there's no annual charge for you. So I think we've got that balance right as well. And we all appreciate that for many decades the environment hasn't been monitored sufficiently, and now that we're upping that and ensuring that our environment is taken care of, that there is a cost to that. So well done to the staff for coming up with a balanced and fair and equitable charging regime.
Well, thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, I'm happy to support this, and obviously it's on its way to Council's recommendation. With some provisos, there are, I'd like to see some reporting on this, and probably 1 year's cycle isn't going to be long enough, but I think probably 2, and maybe that we have it triggered to come back on it 1 year, but I think we actually need to have a look at how this is operating after a couple of years. I hear the discussion around where should the costs lie, and when it comes to consenting, one of the things that is an absolute irritant for consent applications is the cost of commissioning expert reports to support their applications, and then often those reports being peer reviewed by council. I would hope that as a result of us improving, and this should be an objective for us, if we're wanting to be an enabling supportive council that actually heads towards being world-class water managers, and I think we're well on our way to doing that, that our state of the environment monitoring is something that can enable upfront information, open data to applicants so that they're not having to go off and commission what is often incredibly expensive, bespoke reports for their consents. So the outcome for me should be one where we actually have open data that allows applicants to be able to have the dialogue with us, which reduces the need for bespoke reports, or certainly reduces the need for peer review reports, so that we can actually have that dialogue and exchange. And if we head in that direction, then the costs actually should fall significantly, and we should have a much better interaction of people understanding the effect of their activities. So that would be one of the parts I would be looking for. The other part I'm looking for is when I look particularly, say, at the septic tank issue, and my concern is that you need to know what you've got and to really understand what impact you're having on freshwater. And that means knowing where are those old septic tanks that are no longer used, that have been decommissioned, and what state are they in, and are they creating their own problem? So the same goes for the inflow and filtration issues with council infrastructure as we go into public infrastructure, but some of that being privately owned. So to achieve the outcomes we're looking at here, I think we also need to continue with the work that we've got on understanding our underground infrastructure, whether it's privately or publicly owned, and really making sure we've gone through that identification process of what sits under the ground that's no longer used but potentially is an issue if it hasn't been decommissioned in the appropriate way. So that's probably a little bit of a focus to come back for the Works and Infrastructure Committee, because it's when we work across council with all of our interactions that actually we deliver those great results. But just in closing, I think the staff have done a really good job at looking at what is quite a complex picture. And again, I'm just really pleased if we can build up that broad across city environmental monitoring, so that we can have much better open data dialogue interaction with consent, with the public, and with our own organisation.
Any others speak? Councillor Ackland?
Funny enough, I'm actually sitting right on the fence on this one, and I just want to express that, because I know this is going to council, and presumably we're going to have the same debates coming up again then, but and maybe this is something for staff to think about, or I can talk with staff between now and then, is just exactly how much income comes from these fees versus the overall cost of the monitoring activity, because if it's insignificant, and the benefit, really the greater benefit, is to the community at large, one wonders whether or not having that fee and the irritant of that fee, and it really is, I think, exactly as Councillor Barker's expressed, it is a feeling of inequity for the person who's paying, the good guy versus the bad guy. Is it worth having that fee if the overall income is insignificant for the cost? That's something that concerns me, because I think it has been articulated clearly that it's like the dog licensing fee. I'm a good dog owner and I play by the rules, and I get the dog chip or the cat, whatever it is, and I do all those things. And it's the guy next door who doesn't even bother to engage with the system, who gets away with it and doesn't pay anything, the bad guy. And I think there needs to be some real, I'm giving real thought as a governor as to whether or not it's worth sticking in the core of those ratepayers who feel that, consent holders who feel that they are the good guy, they've done all that work, and then actually they're being stung again because they're the low-hanging fruit to pick off, because they're known with their consents. That's my thoughts, whether or not it's worth it.
You'd like to know what the answer.
So, through you, Mr Chair, I'm conscious you're in debate. Picking up both on the Mayor's and Councillor Ackland's comments, if there is some question as to the efficacy of these charges going forward, perhaps you could resolve to include in the resolutions, or you could agree to report back to the Council on the implementation of those charges by November 2020. So we can then talk about what may have been brought in terms of revenue, how they're landing, and what that looks like. So if there is a appetite, we could include something as a...
can't predict that based on current kind of consent numbers and things, no.
We have, through you, Mr Chair, we have done some numbers. We think potentially it could be around 60,000 per annum, but we're not entirely sure. It's because it'll depend each year, it just depends a little bit as to what comes in and what doesn't.
And the monitoring costs, we've got a sense of how much that is, or not quite as easy as that either? Look, I'd be pleased with your, as the mover, Mr Chair, to have that going in so that we can at least have some of that detail and clarity around it. Sorry, and just, I don't mean to scupper the, or not acknowledge the work that's been done. I just think it's an interesting, I think it's an important point to just think about, because I think often these, even though they are important for equity purposes, I think often they do become a real irritant when each year you get an extra little bill and you're thinking, why on earth do I have to pay that extra little bill? And it just becomes that sort of thing in your head.
Environmental monitoring is probably variable. It could be, there's opportunities for it to be improved, and certainly the community expects us to have a better data set of the impact of activities on the environment. And I suppose it's a bit about striking the balance, is that those who are drawing a benefit from use of natural resources probably pay a contribution towards that. And that's why I'm happy to at least have a report back, see if it's actually worth the powder and shot of doing it. So it's a matter of actually striking the balance, and picking up what the Mayor said before, is that our community does expect us, so if we do have a robust data set, robust evidence, is that it can be the single source of truth, if you like, that we're actually agreeing on what is out there, what the state of the environment is, the impact, without getting to experts, and then we just have an argument of experts at a resource consent hearing. My expert costs more than yours, so that sort of thing. We have a census data, there will be some cost savings in that way. So for that reason, I'm happy for this to go forward to Council for to be approved there. So no one wishes to speak. I'll put the motion. Those in favour will say aye. Aye. Those against? Motion's carried. Thanks very much. So that concludes that part of this part of the meeting. Okay, I'll close this part of the meeting. We'll take a break. Perhaps reconvene in about 15 minutes. We give time for the officers to get organised.